K-19's reactor crisis. 3 summers earlier, a different steel box tried to swallow its crew. K-19, the Soviet Navy's new pride, ran cold water drills in the North Atlantic when a hiss turned into a warning that nobody wanted to hear. The primary cooling system failed. Reactor temperature climbed. Gauges crept past safe into guesswork. Men wiped frost from dials with hands that would soon blister from something they couldn't see. Arkhipov was executive officer then, second in command, quiet, methodical. He watched the captain take reports that contradicted each other. Some said the backup pumps could hold. Others said the backup didn't exist in any usable way. The ship had been rushed to sea. Welding seams were still bright. Red paint smelled fresh in the passageways. The plan was to improvise a cooling loop or accept a meltdown at sea. Stakes weren't abstract. K-19 carried missiles, but the immediate threat was the core cooking through its own metal. If that happened, the ocean wouldn't dilute it. It would boil around it. The crew would die first. Then the plume would ride currents and winds to places the map didn't warn about. The decision wasn't war versus peace. It was act now and maybe die versus wait and definitely die. Action was ugly. Sailors stripped pipes and bent them by hand, cutting fingers on burrs, taping leaks with cloth and prayer. They crawled into a compartment bathed in invisible fire and bolted a Frankenstein loop into place. They took turns, minutes per man. No hero speeches, just a list and a stopwatch. Arkhipov stood at the hatch counting down, making the list, arguing for a rotation so nobody stayed long enough to collapse inside. Meanwhile, something else was happening on deck. Panic knocked at the threshold. Rumors moved faster than orders. Men asked if they should prepare lifeboats, if they should surface and broadcast distress. The captain hesitated. Surface meant admitting failure and inviting foreign eyes. Stay down meant solving it alone or dying alone. Arkhipov pressed for clarity before irreversible moves. Surface to assess. Keep COMSEC tight. Don't broadcast unless the loop fails. He wasn't overriding. He was threading choices, so one didn't lock the next. Impact came in silence. The loop worked barely. Reactor temperature stopped climbing and began a slow, stubborn fall. The men who built it stumbled out with their hair already losing color, their skin showing a flush that would turn to burns. They vomited in buckets. Some couldn't stop shaking. The ship lived, but the crew absorbed the bill. Over the next days, men sickened. Some would die soon. Others would carry damage home under uniforms that fit looser. In the aftermath, Arkhipov walked the passageways listening more than talking. He saw what fear did to judgment, how it sped up clocks in men's heads and made any action feel better than the right action. He also saw the cost of waiting too long, how a 5-minute delay turned exposure from survivable to fatal. The lesson wasn't courage or caution. It was calibration. Demand proof before you push the irreversible button. Strip assumptions to the bolt. If you've got 2 bad options, slow the choice until reality tells you which one is actually worse. The Navy recorded a sanitized version. The accident became a line in a logbook and a medal that said service without saying where. But reputations move through whispers. Officers noticed the XO who didn't flinch when the situation turned ambiguous. He didn't turn hard or bitter, he turned careful. In briefings after K-19, he asked questions about communication paths, about redundancies that only existed on paper, about who could say yes and who could say stop. Get this, one detail would travel with him. On K-19, acting fast without a full picture could have turned a catastrophe into a legend of blame. Acting slow would have killed them all. The thread between those poles was verification. Make the reactor numbers tell the truth. Make the sea state tell the truth. Make the world outside your hull tell the truth before you answer to it. When Arkhipov later climbed into B-59, that quiet math came with him. Not bravado, not defiance, just a habit. Before you choose the thing you can't undo, make sure you're not choosing a rumor. The submarine, B-59's design and limits. Foxtrot meant compromise. Long, cigar-hulled, double-skinned and stubborn, B-59 was built to patrol oceans the old way. Diesel on the surface or at snorkel depth, batteries in the deep. On charts it looked capable, 20+ knots if you didn't care who heard you, 8 or 9 on batteries if you did. But once she dipped below periscope depth and shut out the sky, every decision spent air, power, and nerves. Inside, the boat was a metal intestine, tight bends, sweat-slick ladders, red bulbs to save night vision. 50-plus men shared air that thickened by the hour. The numbers told the truth before your lungs did. Carbon dioxide crawled up, oxygen slid down. The scrubbers worked until they didn't, and the heat, trapped by a hull that was never meant for the tropics, pooled in compartments like a fever. Gauges read 45 to 60 degrees Celsius. Shirts turned to rags. Skin prickled. The smell, diesel, oil, damp canvas. Men settled into every screw thread. They carried one weapon that didn't belong on a diesel boat, a 650mm special torpedo with a nuclear warhead. The T-5 was last resort, rendered in steel. It wasn't for knife fights with destroyers. It was a lever meant to move an adversary who thought he had every conventional advantage. The torpedo's logic was brutal. If you corner us and cut our options to none, we'll give you a reason to back away. In the Doctrine briefings, it made a kind of sense. In a heaving control room at 200 meters, with practice charges thumping like fists, sense felt thin. Crew life ran on rationed cycles. Battery charge dictated sleep, food, and temper. When the navigator plotted a course that promised an hour of quiet, men stole minutes with their eyes closed. When the engineer called for conservation, lights dimmed and fans slowed, and every breath felt heavier. Water was sips, not gulps. Food was hot when the galley could run stoves without starving the batteries. Noise discipline was a religion. A dropped wrench could feel like treason. The command triad sat within that pressure cooker, each man holding a piece of authority that overlapped just enough to rub. Savitsky's job was tactical. Keep the hull intact, keep the boat hidden, complete the mission. Maslennikov's was political. Prevent defeatist thought, enforce doctrine, ensure the captain's resolve didn't soften under strain. Arkhipov's authority was quiet but real. Flotilla chief of staff, senior across boats, carrying policy in his head and memory in his bones. On paper their zones were clear. In practice, a depth charge could smear those lines in an instant. Orders from shore had an engineer's elegance and a lawyer's trap. If fired upon, respond. If war begins, act accordingly. From a desk in Moscow, conditions had edges. Below the thermocline, everything blurred. Was a signaling charge a shot? Did an aircraft strafing the waterline count as an attack if the rounds weren't meant to pierce steel? Doctrine didn't sweat. Men did. Technically, B-59 could snorkel, raise a mast, run diesels, sip air and current. In the Caribbean, that was a noisy prayer. A snorkel mast betrayed you to radar. Diesel exhaust betrayed you to eyes. Even at night, a periscope's wake could give you away to patient destroyer 20 cables off your bow. So they went deep when they could, shallow when they had to, and every change in depth stole voltage they couldn't replace without risking a spotlight and a siren. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside the boat that no manual mentioned. Time distorted. The petty officer in sonar heard pings that seemed closer than they were. The helmsman felt turns that weren't there. The medic checked pulse rates that never slowed. Heat does that. CO2 does that. Concussions from above untied knots in the brain that training had tied tight. That's where breaks appear, in the gaps between procedure and perception. And then there was the torpedo room. Men kept their eyes on safety pins, seals, and the quiet, vulgar power sleeping in the special's warhead. The launch sequence was a staircase. Once you walked 3 steps down, unlock, align, flood, you needed a good reason to climb back up, and reasons were hard to hear under steel groaning and officers arguing in low, urgent voices. B-59's limits weren't just hardware. They were human. Every system routed through judgment, of a captain managing humiliation, a political officer reading signals through ideology, and a chief of staff carrying a memory of radiation burns. The boat could take a lot. The people inside it set the real ceiling. And in those days when depth charges stitched the water like punctuation, that ceiling felt low. The hunters, US signals that felt like war. While that pressure built inside B-59, the ocean above turned into choreography. The US Navy had rehearsed this, find, fix, and force to surface without spilling blood. The playbook said, use practice depth charges, the petite cousins of the real thing, just enough explosive to be heard and felt, not enough to tear a hull. To sailors on destroyers, they were messages. To men in a steel tube, they were thunder without translation. The not kill doctrine came out of Washington briefings with neat phrases and clean diagrams. Destroyers would box a contact, maintain distance, and ping with active sonar to make their presence undeniable. Pilots in patrol planes would drop sonarbuoys in patterns that fenced the water, then call bearings like referees with whistles. Signal grenades, small underwater pops, would mark intention. We see you. Surface for identification. The goal was controlled pressure, a ladder with rungs before you reached violence. But there was one problem. The ocean doesn't carry footnotes. The memo that spelled out this signaling protocol didn't ride the thermocline down into a Foxtrot's control room. Some Soviet boats never received the guidance that Americans would use miniature depth charges as language. Even if a captain had heard rumors, concussions were not self-explanatory. A blast feels like a blast. A hull groans the same whether the charge is practice or live. Metal only speaks one dialect. On the American side, professionalism looked like restraint. The carrier group centered on USS Randolph kept its air wing on tight leash. Destroyers like USS Beale and USS Kenai held stations, swept arcs, and logged every ping, every drop, every flash of a searchlight in meticulous watch bills. Officers argued over decibel levels and standoff ranges, calibrating just enough noise to be undeniable. They thought they were steadying the edge. Unknown to them across the thermocline, the effect landed as escalation. In B-59's sonar shack, pings stacked into a wall. The operator's headphones crackled with returns, each one a needle jab. In the torpedo compartment, the floor plates vibrated as charges stitched the water. Pop, pause, closer pop, then a nearer one that made the lights tremble. A sailor tightened his grip on a handrail and tasted copper in his mouth. He didn't know that the powder loads were minimum. He knew his ribs, felt the sea being punched. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the air. US patrol planes flew low passes, searchlights stabbing the waves for a periscope feather. From the conning tower of a surfacing sub, that light is a hard slap. Arkhipov would later describe aircraft overflights at gut-level altitudes, automatic cannon fire chattering into the waterline, warning bursts to keep a boat honest. From a destroyer's deck, those tracers wrote, "Don't try anything." From below, they traced, "We're under fire." This was the moment everything changed in perception. The US intended to box the foe and offer an exit. Come up, identify, charge your batteries and clear out. But intent doesn't survive translation when the medium is explosive shock. On B-59, the pounding layered over heat and code 2 and rumor. In the wardroom, a whispered line moved from mouth to mouth. Washington must have attacked Cuba. There's no other reason for this fury. Back on the American bridge wings, junior officers practiced a new kind of patience. Orders were to avoid depth settings that could crack plates. A bosun's mate counted seconds on a stopwatch after each PDC splash, logging the interval like a metronome. The captain's binoculars tracked faint wakes that might be snorkel trails, then lost them to black water and glare. The plan was to flush, not finish. But there was one more complication: pride. Soviet captains had been told not to be paraded. Surfacing in the middle of a ring of destroyers meant humiliation, photography, and reports that would travel back to fleet headquarters. A political officer would have to account for morale on a boat forced into the spotlight. That made every American signal feel less like etiquette and more like a shove in the chest. What nobody knew at the time was how close the arithmetic ran. Each concussive hello shaved a little more patience. Each minute at depth nibbled away at battery reserve. Each pass by a patrol plane fed the story that war had begun. On one destroyer, a radio man joked that the Russians were being stubborn. Below, a machinist mate clutched a stanchion and thought about his wife's last letter, now damp with sweat in a locker. Meanwhile, something else moved the needle: the memo gap. Washington had cabled embassies. Admirals had briefed commanders. But in the chaos of deployment, not every Soviet flotilla commander passed the word down the chain, and not every boat copied it intact. So the most careful de-escalation scheme in the world reached its audience as percussion and glare. No legend key. The ripple effects were immediate and invisible. In B-59's control room, officers read the blasts as a counter. The signals compressed options until only two seemed left: surface into the teeth of a hostile circle or break out with the one weapon that could stun the pack. Above the waves, a destroyer captain checked the time and prepared another pattern, convinced he was buying safety. Below, a hand hovered over a switch that belonged to a different universe. Everything was about to change when that switch almost clicked. Inside the pressure cooker, 72 hours without air. By the second day, the air tasted like pennies. Men spoke in short bursts and saved breath like currency. Battery needles drooped, each degree of tilt a reminder that time wasn't passing, it was being spent. Fans coughed, then slowed. Heat pooled low and climbed. In the engine room, a machinist ran a rag over his neck and came away with salt you could pinch. Stakes were bone deep now. If they surfaced, they'd be ringed by searchlights and horns, photographed, ordered about in front of their own crew. If they stayed down, the boat would simply run out of breath. Pride against oxygen. Duty against numbers on a dial. Someone muttered that humiliation was survivable, suffocation wasn't. He said it quietly, like a sin. Action took the form of rationing. The engineer dimmed lighting to a dull red smear and pulled non-essential loads off the bus. Galley burners went cold. Water became sips from dented cups. The medic watched lips dry and eyes gloss over. In the torpedo room, men worked slow to avoid spiking their own heart rates. Every movement was a negotiation with air. A petty officer timed ladder climbs and tried to keep jokes alive. They landed flat. No one had breath for laughter. Meanwhile, sonar harassment refused to fade. Pings walked the hull like footsteps above their heads. Practice charges stitched closer, then farther, then close again. The pattern of a hunter keeping contact and reminding them there was only one acceptable exit. The control room took on a rhythm. Count the seconds, brace, feel the tremor ride the frames, check needles, breathe shallow through cloth. The cloth trick barely helped, but ritual steadied hands. This was the moment everything changed internally. Hallucinations tiptoed in. A seaman swore he heard a phone ringing. Another thought he saw frost plume in the beam of a red lamp. Co-2 plays with vision and judgment. It turns shadows into signals. The medic knew the signs and pressed chalk tablets into cracked palms, whispering to keep panic from taking oxygen and order at the same time. One sailor fainted by the watertight door. Two men lifted him without the grunt that would steal from their lungs. Unknown to them across the Atlantic, diplomats measured adjectives. On B-59, rumors measured fear. Someone had caught a civilian broadcast days earlier, something about missiles and Kennedy and Khrushchev. By now it had grown teeth. The wardroom birthed a story. The Americans must have struck. Why else would destroyers behave like this? Without fresh signals, the rumor hardened into doctrine. Officers' dilemmas sharpened. The navigator's chart sweated under his forearms. He argued for a night surface, quick charge, minimal profile. The political officer countered with humiliation, photographs, morale. The captain paced in meter-long steps, turning on his heel like a metronome. Every quotient landed on the same denominator, batteries. The engineer's estimate shrank each time he ran it. Noise discipline cost them a chance to laugh. It bought them a little more silent time. Medical strain turned from background to foreground. Co-2 scrubbers were near failure, canisters chalking white on the edges. The medic bled a man's nose in the head to give him the shock of cool water and the illusion of a reset. It worked for 10 minutes. Eyes reddened. Headaches took root at the base of skulls. A junior officer rubbed his temples and misread a depth change, calling out a number 2 meters off. The helmsman corrected without comment. That's how fatigue shows up, not in grand errors, in tiny slips that add up. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside the captain. The harassment didn't feel like pressure anymore. It felt like contempt. The ladder of options had lost rungs. He could surface into a ring and be stage managed, or he could break the ring. His voice, when he gave orders, had the grit of someone already at the edge. He snapped at a rating, then bit the apology back. Commanders can't bleed weakness when the boat is starving for air. Arkhipov watched without spectacle. He slept in short slices, checked stations, asked the engineer to show him the numbers and make him believe them. He visited the torpedo room with its quiet, monstrous cylinder and asked about seals and pins, as if a small problem there could be a reason not to choose the big problem. He remembered K-19, the way fear made fast choices look like salvation until they hit reality. He kept asking the same question: what can we verify? Impact arrived as a cluster of near-simultaneous bangs that made the overhead shed dust. Lights dimmed, then steadied. A gauge needle jittered, then settled a hair lower than before. Men tensed, waiting for a leak that didn't come. The captain's jaw clenched so hard a tendon stood out. He called the political officer over and pointed with 2 fingers toward the torpedo room. The gesture was simple: readiness. What nobody knew at the time was that the last hours at depth would right the argument. The medic took pulse after pulse and made eye contact with Arkhipov. The look said, "We're at the edge." The engineer, voice measured, described battery voltage like a eulogy. The rumor of war had become a working assumption. The captain sensed he was being forced into the choice his doctrine authorized and his pride preferred. Everything was about to change when Arkhipov decided that before they chose suffocation or fire, they would choose air. The launch debate: 2 votes for fire. The order came clipped, like it hurt to say. Arm the special torpedo. The word special moved through the compartments with a chill the heat couldn't touch. In the torpedo room, hands went to practice places. Safety covers off, interlocks checked, the big 650mm tube becoming the center of the boat's gravity. A petty officer announced each step too loudly, as if volume could steady his breathing. Flood valves stood ready like decisions with handles. Stakes sharpened to steel points. From their perspective, the Americans weren't signaling anymore. They were herding. Every blast said you don't get to choose. For men who trained to avoid shame as much as defeat, the humiliation of surfacing under searchlights tasted worse than oil. The captain's logic was brutally clean: break the ring, buy space, climb to air behind a curtain of chaos. And if war had started above, a deterrent strike wasn't a crime, it was obedience. Action accelerated. Captain Savitsky leaned over the attack periscope, well as if staring into an invisible horizon. He snapped at fire control, set gyro for nearest contact, short run, detonation depth shallow. The political officer, Maslenikov, stepped in at his shoulder, voice formal and steady, invoking doctrine and retaliatory measures in case of hostile action. He didn't use the word nuclear. He didn't have to. His consent made 2. What nobody knew at the time was how close the ladder was to its last rung. The launch sequence, once walked, resists reversal. Unlock safeties, energize circuits, rotate inner doors. The torpedo itself is indifferent. It wants a path. The fire control officers moved like they were walking through syrup, disciplined, slow enough to avoid mistakes, fast enough to obey. A young sailor on the manual winder watched his knuckles go white and didn't loosen his grip. This was the moment everything changed, because Arkhipov stepped into the space between order and execution. He didn't raise his voice. He used rank. Flotilla Chief of Staff, senior aboard, veto power on special weapons. This wasn't custom, it was protocol. He said no, and the word didn't echo, it landed. He followed it with reason. We cannot confirm war, we must surface to verify. K-19 lived in his tone without being named. Stakes tightened again. 2 votes was momentum, 3 was annihilation. The blasts didn't pause to let them argue. A near one shivered the overhead and showered dust. Maslenikov squared himself, citing political responsibility, accusing hesitation of weakness. He framed it as morale. The crew needed decisive action. Arkhipov reframed it as survival. They needed oxygen and facts. He pointed at the medic's tally and the engineers' numbers like exhibits in a trial. Action turned to a clash of cadences. Savitsky's speech was staccato, orders, corrections, the clipped code of command under pressure. Arkhipov's was even, an anchor line over the side. He asked fire control to state the step they were on. Interlocks disengaged. He asked what was next. Energize firing circuit. He said hold. The word tasted like mutiny to some ears, like sanity to others. The room's temperature didn't change, but the air felt thinner. Impact started immediate and human. A senior rating, loyal to the captain, shifted his stance toward the console. He wasn't going to fire on his own. He was going to be ready when the debate flipped. Another sailor, eyes rimmed red, risked a glance at Arkhipov like a drowning man spotting a rope. The political officer pressed again. Doctrine, retaliation, dignity. Arkhipov pressed back. If we're alive enough to retaliate, we're alive enough to surface. Verify, or you're shooting at shadows. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the captain. Pride and duty were welded together inside him, and the heat had softened that weld. He'd been forced for days, and forcing back felt like reclaiming command. Arkhipov didn't attack that. He offered a different kind of command. Choose the risk you can survive. He proposed a path. Surface with flags ready, engines idle, hatches cracked just enough to breathe, show no panic, acknowledge no fault. He made humiliation sound like control. This was the pivot. Savitsky's eyes cut to the engineer. Voltage. The answer came flat, minutes at most before instruments become lies. He looked to the medic. Men are at limits. He looked to Maslenikov. The commissar's jaw was set like a seal on a document. Then he looked at Arkhipov, who didn't blink. The silence lasted one beat too long, and in that beat the boat seemed to tilt. The captain swore under his breath, a word that released something. He swung to fire control and ordered safeties re-engaged. The petty officer's hands trembled, but the clicks came clean. He told the torpedo room to stand the special down to ready, not armed. You could hear the exhale ripple through steel. Maslenikov protested on principle, then deferred to the hierarchy he couldn't change. Impact rippled outward. The launch that would have rewritten maps had been one step away. Now it was a memory of a path not taken. The boat still shook with concussions, still simmered in heat, still starved for air. But the irreversible had been deferred. Arkhipov didn't celebrate. He moved to the periscope well, not to look. There was nothing to see at that depth, but to stand where the next decision would be made.